miles away from Zululand. And so that 1/5 of the African continent was fully affected by the rise of Shaka. It was a powerful thing. The jihad states in West Africa, the Sokoto Caliphate, in a period of about 10 years, grew from nothing to a 350,000 square mile state. Square miles. You know, it was a really big event. The same thing with the Omani Empire. So, all of these things created enemies within Africa. When the Zulu spread, the Shona, you know, and other groups of people hated the Zulu. You know, when the jihad spread and the Fulani leaders took over the political leadership of Hausaland, the Hausas hated the Fulani. When the slave trade was dying down and there was still more internal slave trade going on, the Bambara hated the Songhai. They hated the Messina. They hated the people who were involved in the slave trade and fighting them. So while these new states expanded, they created enemies and they kept fighting within Africa. And the Europeans saw that. Next. They saw how the slave trade in Dahomey and other places had really brutalized the society and made it a very bloodthirsty place. This is what do you call this? Decapitation ceremonies. And they really played, these Europeans really played this up in the media. To backtrack for just a second, the illustrations that you see, the Europeans learned to read from the penny magazines, the Petite Parisienne and the illustrated graphics, the daily, the graphic of the London Illustrated News, you know, things like that. They learned how to read, just like the Americans learned to read about on the stories of the Wild West and the adventure dime novels and those kinds of things. But in Europe, the stories that they were learning to read were stories of Africa. So many of the illustrations that you see come from those stories. They physically are pulled right from those pages. Next, please. So Dahomey was portrayed as bloodthirsty, and you saw the internal slave trade as being something that did not slow down, because you had the jihad states, because you had the rise of Asante and the pressure on Fanti, and all of these things happening. There were slaves, captives of war, and other groups of people who were being enslaved during this period as well. Next. They saw the big cities, and I'm just backing up here for a second. This is a shot of Kano, from the inside of Kano. Remember we talked about the wall of Kano? This is what it looked like from the inside. And you really, I mean, I've seen people say this and say, oh man, that's just a mud city, man. No, this is what would be called adobe in this country. But check this out. I'm going to point, and I'm going to use this pointer that Obadele has graciously lent me. I'm going to point to a person with a very large basket on their head. Okay? You see them? That's how big these buildings are. They saw big cities, big buildings, great amounts of opportunity for trade. For trade. They realized that the slave trade was nothing in money compared to what they could make on what they called legitimate trade. And they saw the culture. They saw the large amounts of high civilization and the value of things that they could be getting out of Africa, such as the Ife cultures in Nigeria and the great artwork that was done among the Yoruba and Yoruba-speaking peoples of southern Nigeria. So we're going to move on. Now, okay, so here we are. I'm going to do a little bit of pointing, because when we start talking about Africa here, we're talking about, they saw this is a great area of defensibility in the Niger Bend, Hausaland in this area, the Yoruba city-states in here, the Ashanti and the Khan here, you have the Fulani states, the Mandingo states, and many of the southern, and there are many, many states that when you start talking about the Temne, the Mende, the rest are in this area. When you start getting to the rest of here, you start to see large numbers of areas from the desert fringes all across to Ethiopia, to the Somalis, to the peoples of the lakes. All of these were highly populated regions. So when the Europeans started to travel in these regions, and by the early 1860s, they realized that there was absolutely no way that they could colonize these places. They did not have the manpower. Also, they had had experiences in Africa. This is a picture taken from the 1830s in Algeria of a brother's name, whose name was Abdel Kadir. And Abdul Kadir, I should say, is in the center. I believe that this is he, right here. Okay. He led the resistance. You understand that in the early 1800s that the French were reeling from the defeat of Napoleon's empire. One of the things they tried to do was to settle other places. And Algeria, with its rich coastline and fertile coastline, offered a good possibility of settlement in their eyes. But they realized that the resistance of the people was going to be there. And this brother, Abdel Kadir, led a huge resistance. In fact, it took 104,000 French troops in the field. Did you hear me? 104,000 French troops in the field to subdue the resistance of Abdel Kadir in the 1830s. Okay, Shaka and the rise of Zulu really made a difference in their view of southern Africa. The Europeans, Shaka had two generals, Mzilikazi and Zwagendaba, who took off, who escaped from Shaka with their own armies, and they were so militaristic, they had such a sense of attrition warfare, that every place they camped, they would depopulate the area for 10 miles. Depopulation means not grabbing people and saying move, but killing people, you know, for 10 miles around the area. Some of these areas are where the Boers moved into in the Great Trek. You see, but because of the heavy level of militarization that Shaka Zulu and the discipline that Shaka Zulu and his rise brought into Southern African history, South Africa is not America. South Africa was supposed to be America, you understand? A successful white settling colony where they committed genocide on the people. But they couldn't because the people were too strong. The people were too strong. In fact, in Zululand, it was a nightmare for white people. Doesn't this look like the American West? Look again. Circling the wagons. See? Next, please. This is a Zulu attack. And the Zulu actually defeated a regiment of the British Army in 1879 in the Battle of Ishwandwala. Ishwandwala was one of the lessons that the Europeans learned about fighting Africans hand to hand. Their cartridge boxes, their wagons that had their ammunitions got jammed on, and they ended up having to fight hand to hand and got their butts kicked. Excuse my use of the vernacular. How should I say? They got severely defeated. Next, please. So the Europeans had started to get some experience, and they know they couldn't easily defeat the Africans. And they began to rely more and more, and see, we are actually getting back to our subject, aren't we? They began to rely more and more on their use of African troops. These were not ragtag, let's bring you in to fight this battle troops. These were well-disciplined, well-paid troops, and we're about to get into that right now. This is a wonderful illustration. You see in it the British officer and the West African Frontiers Force troops. Actually, these in 1874 were just, they weren't the West Africans, they were the West Indian regiments at that point. And you see they're being fired on. You see they're being fired on by the Ashanti from the bush, Africans with guns, right? They're being fired on. And the Fanti, who are being, brought in as sort of auxiliaries, representing their traditional militaries, not the British, are running, looking for cover, right? But the Africans trained by the British are standing firm. Okay, I want you to see that because there's a difference between the African militaries and the irregulars that were also a part of the scramble for Africa. The French developed in the 1850s under Louis Fardeher and other militaristic-minded people started slowly inching up the Senegal River, recruiting larger and larger numbers of French from the Bambara, French troops from the Bambara, and creating regiments of what we have here, Tirailleurs Senegalais. Okay, this is probably the most important section of this lecture. Could I have some more cold water, please? That which made the colonization of Africa possible was a change that took place in military armaments. It not only made the colonization of Africa possible, it made the colonization of America possible. It made the colonization of South America and of Asia and of other parts of the world possible. This is represented in the next two illustrations. Prior to the 1860s, all of the weapons of war were muzzle-loading, musket type in design. Cannons. Remember the images of cannons where you go and you put the cannonball or the shrapnel inside the cannon from the front? You know, here's the front of the cannon, you stuff it in the cannon, and you know how you have rifles, muskets like that? How many of you have seen the movie Dances with Wolves? Okay. Dances with Wolves is a wonderful example. Remember in the beginning of the movie? Thank you, Jeffrey. Remember in the beginning of the movie, whatever his name is riding in front of the Confederate troops trying to commit suicide. They're all shooting at him, and they're what? Missing him. They're all shooting muskets, aren't they? They're taking them, and this is in 1861. They're taking the muskets, they're loading them, and they're shooting at him, boom, and missing him. And he's not far, he's like 50, 70 yards in front of them, riding on a horse, big target, right? By the end of the movie, they're giving the newer weapons to the Sioux in the plain. Remember they dug up the weapons, and the Sioux were fighting the Pawnee. And the Sioux, who haven't been trained in these weapons, are taking these weapons, clicking it once, running down there and saying, boom, shooting the people. Different type of weapons. Between the years 1860 and 1880, there was a revolution that took place in arms manufacture. This revolution made the colonization of Africa possible with the addition of large numbers of troops, of manpower. This is a good illustration from African history records of that. Of Dahomean arms captured in 1890 compared to the same capture of African armaments captured in 1900, 1891. They got hold of the new weapons, and that's what was being shown here. You see the difference? The familiar bottleneck cartridges? Brothers and sisters, this is heavy stuff. This is heavy stuff. If we want to really know what the deal is that whatever is the best and the most powerful technology is what's going to be used against us. When they went to bomb Iraq, did they walk in hand to hand with rifles? Man, they were in planes 15 miles away. The range of their effective use of weapons changed in the 1860s to 1880s or so. It changed so that whereby in 1860 they could be 100 yards away and their effectiveness dropped. They could now be a half mile away. They could now be a mile and a half away. Some cases they could be 5 miles away. And brothers and sisters, this is how Africa was colonized. Tremendous firepower. The philosophy was to put as much, I'm going to show it to you. I'm not just, pontificating. The fact is that their philosophy was firepower. They would put as much firepower and as intense create killing zones as is humanly possible at that time with the new technology. Not only were these new weapons invented, the rifle accuracy really increased dramatically in the power of the weapons, but also machine guns. Gatling guns and initially proved not to be that effective, but the Maxim gun was really the gun that was the weapon that was used primarily in the colonization of Africa. Rocket launchers, mortars, 12-pounders, 9-pounders, 7-pounders, all of them were used in these large military invasions of Africa. Next, please. The use of black troops in the European colonial armies had been slowly growing from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Here we have an example of the use of Sudanese troops in Egypt. The story of Egypt is so deep and complex, I'd rather do a presentation on it than to do a synopsis of it. But that particular story with the troops of the Khedive in Egypt meant that what happened was that with the building of the Suez Canal in 1869, the investment of British military in the Sudan and in Egypt was quite heavy and quite strong, and much of the troops that they used were African troops and native troops here. Here we have an example of Sudanese troops. Now you have to see the difference here. This is pretty deep. Okay. Here we have right here the Sudanese troops, and this is not a Sudanese troop. This is a Sudanese national. The Sudanese troops were British regulars. You see their uniforms? Okay, and these are Mahdi's forces in the Sudan. So it gets to the point where all the people fighting just about were black people, and you only have to look at the uniforms to see what side they were on. We'll do questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, next please. Okay, the French began to use larger and larger numbers of troops. You see the larger weapons being used, the machine guns. These troops were primarily tirailleurs Senegalese. Next. The African soldiers showed the Europeans how to fight African style. And you had to fight African style in Africa. You really do. And they showed them how to disappear, how to become invisible, how to blend and camouflage. Now the question is, you know, and this partially response there, where did these troops come from? We talked about that briefly. Most of the troops were recruited from groups of people that had lost the struggles, the internal African struggles, earlier in the century. Next, please. This was a very difficult, the colonization of Africa was one of the great stories in African history. It was a very difficult series of campaigns that required a lot of preparatory work. For example, roads had to be built just to move big guns. They could not have colonized Africa without some of the bigger guns, the big steamboats. Here you have, for example, steamboats, and you can see this very clearly, being built on the Senegal. See, they're being built in sections, and large amounts of workers were needed to build these steel-plated steamboats that would go up and down the river and be able to fire a mile, 2 miles away from the river. Next, please. So in the work crews to make roads and develop some of the other military infrastructure became an important part of this, and they, again, were recruited from African labor sources. Without those, it would not have been possible for the military machines to make it into the interior of Africa. Remember, the whites were just starting to travel in themselves as individuals. And they said, my God, look at all these people. Look at all these armies. There is no way we can do this unless we use the biggest and the baddest weapons that exist. So they had to literally bring the biggest and the baddest weapons into the interior of Africa. Heavy stuff, isn't it? Now, why did they have to do this? Because the Africans wouldn't let them. This, brothers and sisters, is part 1 of the lecture, How Africa Was Colonized. Part 2 is how the Africans resisted colonization. We're not doing that today. This is just how the Europeans managed it by recruiting in Africa. See, now the real story is that the Africans, by the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, fought off the European colonization. Tooth and nail. It took, with these new weapons, with machine guns that could shoot 600 rounds a minute. 600 rounds a minute, a half a mile away effectively, that could shoot that far with machine guns. It still took them 30 years to colonize Africa. With bombs and mortars that could set a town on fire from 3 miles away, it still took them 30 years to colonize Africa. So the work that it required to get these massive amounts of arms and armaments and armies into the interior of Africa is a great part of this story. It was a difficult struggle. These are European workers, and the rain has come. You can see the Europeans here too, can't you, in the picture? See the Europeans here? It's a bivouac, and the rain has come, and they've run out of water. They formed very tight, very, very, there are many books written on their individual struggles and on the individual campaigns and the difficulties that existed in these campaigns. But you see here that rain, they were desperate for water many times. This is very different from the Great White Hunter, isn't it? Next, please. Okay, the Europeans made a full use of interpreters, African interpreters. It's a very intense story. Next. Ambush was the greatest defense that the Africans put up against it. Again, we'll talk about some of the big battles in a few minutes, actually. But here you have, now look, think of the Great White Hunter for a moment. The Great White Hunter walks into this African village, bam, and everybody runs, right? Here are European troops, fully armed, and they're running for their lives to prevent themselves from being ambushed by the Africans. The Africans figured out that these Europeans had better weapons. The Africans had guns, but the Europeans had come in with better guns. And when they figured out they had better weapons, they said, we're going to ambush these people. Sometimes the European columns were ambushed 6 times a day. 6 times a day. There were columns, these were black European troops, you got to understand that. There were columns that took 2 years. You all talked about the Fashoda incident and Marchand and all the rest of that. Marched for 2 years across, just to travel across. In the western Niger, it took the French 2 years just to build forts. There were columns that they traveled with that built 11 forts in a year and a half. 11 forts. They couldn't travel 50 miles. Remember how big Africa is. They couldn't travel 50 miles without having to build another fort. They wouldn't have stayed through the week. It was a difficult campaign for them. And they themselves allowed the African troops. They have all kinds of comments. The Hausa troops, for example. The British talk about the Hausa troops, and they say the Hausa are the strongest people in the world. They had one European come up to this, the machine gun mounting. And they told the European, try to pick this up. Another European told him, try to pick this up. And the guy tries, he says, I can't budge it, man. He says, no, really try to pick this up. And the guy says, oh, no, man. He just sort of sweats and shivers and stuff and strains and can't pick it up. Then he calls his brother over there, his Hausa brother, and says, would you pick this up? The brother picks the doggone thing up over his head. He says, and you know what? That brother marches 17 miles a day with that thing over his head. The Africans that were trained by the Europeans were cool under fire. They had to be because they were fired on a lot. Next, please. This is a good example. There are really thousands of examples once we get to this point. This is one of the best documented facts and periods in African history. It is better documented than Nile Valley civilization is. And you're going to find that hard to believe, but it's true. This is better documented. There are many more books on this subject. Sometimes you might have to read French or German or British. British is different reading than American English. But anyway, this is a good example from a French source published in 1891. And here we have, remember we talked about the city of Tubakunda? This is the city of town of Tubakunda. As you'll note, and I hope you can see it here, okay, this is a city with a triple wall around it, and a moat. Here's a moat, here's one wall, here's a second wall, here's a third wall. It's a small town in the Upper Gambia, and it was the headquarters and the last stand for Mamadou Lamine. Mamadou Lamine was a Muslim teacher who gathered people around in resistance to colonialism, and they made him the target of a really intense campaign. Next. When he was holed up in Tubakunda, and here's the French army from their own sources. Now remember this Great White Hunter scenario? It's stupid when you think about it that we believe this. This is more like, this is fact. So here is someplace, a small place again. This is not a big place. This is in Upper Gambia, and you see Mamadou, here there is Tubakunda back here, and they're firing on Tubakunda. You see all the French troops here, all the circle around here, see this is smoke. It's smoke. This is gun smoke here, and troops here, carrying the lean-tos for heavy weapons, etc. Troops on horseback. they fired, Mamadou Lamine was holed up in Tubakunda. They fired 30,000 rounds at Tubakunda for 1 hour. Now, you all saw the movie, maybe you didn't, I like movies, so maybe a lot of other people don't look at them like I do. Did you see the movie Predator? Okay, there was a scene in Predator where they see this, they imagine this enemy or this alien is there, and they all stand up with their heavy guns, and they're, you know, until all you hear is this din from their weapons. They didn't fire 30,000 rounds. They fired 30,000 rounds here at Tubakunda. That wasn't 30,000 rounds. They might have fired 10 during that time, but they didn't fire 30. See, the idea of the colonization of Africa, the military approach that the Europeans used was firepower. It says blow the Africans out of the scene if possible. And if not, keep them so far away they can't attack. So here's Tubakunda, and they fired on Tubakunda. Guess what? Mamadou Lamine escaped. Mamadou Lamine escaped. They were trying to get him, fired 30,000 rounds. Here's a photograph of it, an illustration from the actual invasion. Okay, they tried to kill him, and they weren't able to kill Mamadou Lamine. The British began a much more aggressive policy of recruitment. Remember at the beginning we showed these two maps, and that from 1890 to 1900 there was a tremendous increase in the number of troops that the Europeans were using in the colonial invasion of Africa. They hired troops, this particular soldiers from the West African Frontiers Force. We're doing a publication on this now, and we're going into a little more detail on the West African Frontiers Force. But you see here, this is a brother. He's got a Lebel rifle. You know, sometimes they use Remingtons. Whatever was the newest technology is what these troops were armed with. Next, please. We have so many illustrations from this period. It's very difficult, once we get to here, to select the illustrations we're going to use because there's so many. Really, I mean, we could do 5 hours. If you guys want to help us to do a documentary that uses the illustrations, we could do 5 hours of presentations on this subject because the illustrations and the graphic record is so strong. Here we have recruitment. Again, it's not about divide and rule. It's about divide, recruit, arm, train, engage, and deploy. And then, at the end of all that process, there was a sphere of influence that wasn't there in the beginning. So here we have a recruitment station set up in Nigeria around 1900. And look, this brother here don't want to have his photograph taken, you know. But by this time, the Europeans had a reputation of having an almost invincible army. They had lost Ishwandwala, they had lost several battles and stuff, but their armies kept getting bigger and bigger, and by the year 1900, they were supposed to be bad. But brothers and sisters, let me show you what was happening just before 1900, just around 1900. The Europeans had to fight the African cavalry. This is a photograph